Everybody. Super excited to be here today. And I know as we talk about Leader as Translator, that maybe sounds easy, but I am sure in your roles, it probably is at times somewhat challenging. So I am going to be with SBP throughout this leadership series. As Kyle mentioned, a number of different leadership programs we're going to bring to you. I will not be the only facilitator that you will get an opportunity to work with, because we're going to bring some other people on our team as well. But I am the head of executive development for Farmers Insurance. So that means leadership and culture, primarily for all of our most senior leaders. So I'm super excited. And I think you're going to have some fun today. But before we dive in, just a couple of things. You guys are so good about the videos. I love that. We are going to do a combination of things today. We're going to share a little bit of content, kind of a new process, a way to think about your role as a translator. And then we're going to share an example, which Kyle is going to take us through. And then we're going to let you guys have an opportunity with sort of a case study, if you like, and we're going to put you into breakout groups and let you talk as smaller groups, and then come back and share your thoughts with the larger team. So the good news is your videos will carry with you as you move into the breakout rooms. So don't think you can hide, because they'll see your name and not your picture if you're not there. And also, if you have handy, we sent out a workbook, whether you have it printed or you have a digital copy. Having that with you will help you when you're in the breakout rooms. Okay, so I guess the last thing was just to say, please, the more engaged you can be in this conversation, the more interesting and the more you're going to learn. So when we do the breakouts and we come back, I'll probably call on some folks, but you absolutely can raise your hand. There is a button. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but hopefully you can find that pretty easily. You can raise your hand, or you can just come off mute and say, hey, I've got a question. We encourage that, because if you're thinking about something, that somebody else is probably wondering the same thing. Okay, are we ready to go? Ready to have some fun? I hope so. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little icebreaker, because I think this is kind of fun. So what I'd like you to do is just take a minute, working on your own. Think of the word kamusta or kamusta and translate that into English without any help. So what do you think is the translation for this word? And if you know, let us know. Come off mute and share your thoughts. Anybody? Looks like a word I made up, but I actually did not. And actually, in our first group, Kyle, I think we had a couple of people with guesses that were kind of close. But so the definition of kamusta is hello in Filipino. And so what's interesting about this is, like, we don't know that if we don't speak Filipino, right? So it would have to be translated for us. So when you think of that, does anybody have an experience where you've tried to translate something, whether it be a foreign language or anything really? How easy or difficult is that? Anyone?
I've got a son who is actually from the Philippines, but he is partially deaf and partially blind in sign language. And so in my poor attempt to tell him to feed the dogs, basically I gave him the command, feed or eat the dog.
The dog.
Instead of feed the dog.
Okay, that is Ron. Is that how you pronounce your name? Ran?
It's ran like run.
Okay, nice. What a great story, because that is the reality, right? Is that we are trying to learn someone else's language and we are trying to translate, but it's just not always perfect. So in there, right, lies the challenge of your role. So we're going to start with an introductory video. It's a couple of minutes long, like 2.5 minutes long. which I think does a much better job than I can do of explaining all the nuances. We'd like you to think of your role as the translator in the middle. So you're going to hear about the architect, which is really senior executives, and the achievers are the people that are on your teams, on the front lines, carrying out a lot of the day-to-day work. So hang on, and we'll play the video, and then we'll come back and do a bit of a summary, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
In most teams, there are two primary roles: people who plan and people who execute the plan. Let's call them architects and achievers. Architects take a broad view of things. They listen, observe, and collaborate to help the organization set a common direction, help us align towards common goals, strategies, and approaches. Achievers provide the technical expertise to execute the vision and make it all happen. They align local action with the organizational strategy and gain experience to provide architects with feedback on how things are working. Communication between these roles is critical to success. In small organizations, this dynamic is relatively simple. Architects might often communicate directly with achievers, address achievers' questions, then listen to achievers' feedback and ideas to make adjustments to the strategy or focus on new priorities. It's fairly direct. But in larger organizations like ours, it becomes a bit more challenging. Architects may not get to talk directly with achievers. People leaders at all levels must, as their primary role, act as liaisons between architects and achievers, translating messages between these roles. Let's call the primary role of people leaders translator, facilitating understanding between architects and achievers. Being a successful translator is critical to being a successful people leader. This is how it works. Architects communicate their plans and organizational strategies to optimize our business results to people leaders. Acting as translators, people leaders first receive messages from architects, seek clarity on them, considering how it impacts them as an achiever. Then, having gained that clarity, they translate architects' messages into actions for achievers they lead, so achievers can align their behaviors to effectively execute our strategy. To complete the communication circle, translators also receive feedback from achievers how the strategy is affecting them, and must seek clarity to consider how it impacts the organization from the viewpoint of an architect. Only then can they translate that feedback to architects who consider how to address that feedback from a strategic standpoint. Essentially, translators must be able to play the role of architect and achiever, considering how messages from architects and feedback from achievers affect them personally before they can share those messages. Because translators play both roles, they must first be able to personally understand the messages from the viewpoints of architect and achiever, then be able to articulate those messages with meaning and context between those roles. For example, they must be able to help achievers understand where we're headed as a company, what achievers can do individually, and how they can do it to help us achieve our strategic objectives. Translators observe and align achievers' actions with our strategies, address their unconscious associations, and listen to achievers' feedback about our strategy and direction. They help achievers take ownership of our strategy. Translators then relay what they learned from observing and listening to achievers to architects to help architects evaluate impact and formulate changes to our strategy for improvement. Architects rely heavily on achievers' feedback on what's happening locally, what's working, what's not, and what it all means in terms of priorities. It's critical that you, as a people leader, help achievers understand how to locally and individually, while helping architects understand how our strategies are working. It's a very difficult task that translators don't always get right, but one for which we should be striving for improvement. Want to be a more successful people leader? Become a better translator.
I love video, right? Sorry about that. Kind of came out a little bit. So let me just come back. So what I'd like to do, so I do think the video, I think, sort of exemplifies how challenging this role can be, right? The role of translator. So just a quick overview, and then we'll talk through an example, right? Because I think that's the best way to try and learn. But the architect or the senior leadership has got some message or some strategy, right, that they want to communicate down to the translator. So your role is to really understand it. Any challenges or issues you think there might be with whatever they're asking you to do. And then you've got the achiever. You've got to create meaning. This is where the real translation comes in, right? Because I think you really have to create a way of communicating that so that people are going to feel aligned and they're going to want to take some action. Is that easy, do you think, in your role, translating what's expected always down to the people that work for you? Anybody?
No, I'll jump on that. No, it's not.
No, right?
Because you've got to be able to basically, architects, strategic leaders have big visions, and you've got to break it down, depending on what level you're at, but you've got to break it down into specific tasks that individuals understand with timelines, deadlines for those tasks. So it's almost literally like translating a language from a strategic level to basically a tactical level down where the rubber meets the road.
That's exactly right. So even if you have a team of people, are you going to translate it in the same exact way for each person, do you think?
No, I think one of the hardest parts of translating is explaining it in a way where the other person understands why it's important for them, right?
Yep.
So it seems as something that they should invest or buy in, as opposed to, a mandate from heaven or some
Right.
pure or vague objective.
You are absolutely right on. I call that the WIFM, what's in it for me. Like, so I know senior leadership wants this, but why do I want this, right? And I think until people really buy in personally, they don't ever really get aligned, right? And then you're not going to get the same level of performance you might. So I think the translating down is really tough. Then when you go and talk to the achievers, right? They're going to give you some feedback, right? Does anybody not get feedback from the people that work for you? They just take direction and they go, okay, I'll go do that. And they do it consistently every time. Probably not, right? So they're going to have ideas, suggestions, things that they don't think we considered, etc. So that feedback is going to come back to you. And then you're going to have to translate that back up to the architects and say, I know we're looking at doing X, Y, and Z, but here are some of the challenges that people on the front line are seeing. And we may need to make some adjustments in our messaging, our strategy, whatever it is that we're working with. So what we thought we would do, and we have found this really helpful at Farmers, is we developed a process. It's kind of a step-by-step process that will take you through both the process of translating down and the process of translating up. So we'll talk about that in 1 minute. But I've got 4 qualities of effective translators. What do you think are some of the qualities? Does anybody want to make a stab at these? What do you think you need to do to be effective at this role?
I'm going to say they need to be concise and clear.
Nice. What else?
Probably have to be a good listener.
Good listener. Love that. Anybody else?
I think understanding your achievers and that they're not all going to be communicated the same way.
Yep, I think that's a big one. Now, not all of these are going to be captured in here, but everybody had a correct answer. Communicate clearly is a big area. So I think that means clear, that means concise, and it means you're targeting your communication to the individual achiever. Everybody wants to feel like you're talking to them in a way that they're going to understand. So that's the first step. Make the message actionable. What do you think we mean by that? Why does it need to be actionable?
Otherwise, the individual's not going to know what to do next after you tell them something.
Yeah, so what in my experience that when you communicate something like everybody, it's like that telephone game, you know, everybody can interpret what you said differently. So if you want a specific action, you're much more likely to get that than some variety, right? Some alternative. Um, and the third area, which I think kind of goes without saying, right? We've got to lead by example. It's not helpful to like tell your people to do something and you do exactly the opposite. I'm sure that's not the case with any of you, but sometimes we find that they're not practicing what they preach. And then lastly, you are obtaining and delivering feedback. So part of this is the listening that somebody mentioned. You've got to really be active listening in order to really hear.
Thank you all for active listening. I'm sure Kathy.
Can you hear me? Okay, that was really weird, but everybody went away. Can you still see the screen?
You lost the presentation, it looks like. And Kathy, it seems like you're freezing up.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so.
Oh, so it. I just made you the host.
Challenge. Just one moment. We'll come back to the. It just says it's unstable, but try and get back here. Okay, can you see it now?
Yep, all good.
All right. Well, I hope we. It's always fun, you guys. This is part of the new virtual world that we live in. So you never know. Okay, so we're talking about the obtain and deliver feedback, right? So it's listening so that you really hear it. But I think the other part of this is that your achievers are counting on you to deliver that feedback back to the architects. So we need to make sure that we do that as well. So what I'd like to
do. Sorry, y'all.
Okay, interesting.
Right. I just made you the host again. I guess every time that happens, it'll bump me back to host, but just transferred it back to you.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I don't know. This is just, I apologize, everybody. We haven't had this problem before. Yeah. And then I think that the screen goes away as well. Okay, so I'm gonna jump in and talk fast because I'm not sure what's going on. But we're gonna start with translating from architect to achiever. There's 5 steps. We're gonna talk about this, and then we're also gonna give you guys a chance to work on this so that you can actually do this for yourself. But the first step is the architect is gonna have a vision. They should be sharing with you where they want to go. And they should be giving you some specific strategies. Typically, they'll have some ideas or suggestions as to how we might want to implement this. So this is our plan. What's the plan to get us there? There might be some specific tactics. What is expected? What are the desired outcomes? Sometimes we're even given some pretty clear metrics, right? Some things that we're really, really aiming towards. And then the other thing that you should be hearing from the architects is, here are the resources that we're going to provide you with to support you. These can be mostly people or human resources. Sometimes they're financial resources or a combination, right? But they, if there's a lot more being asked, there's typically some way you're going to be supported. And then lastly, this is the part you guys were just talking about, right? The what's in it for me. They're going to say, they should be clearly articulating, what are the benefits? Why are we doing this? Not just for senior leadership, but for everybody in the organization. So does anybody have any questions? I think the steps seem a little bit straightforward. I think it will help to actually get into an example. So what I thought we would do here is have Kyle. We've actually looked at the sort of the mission and the values and all that stuff for you guys. And so Kyle, would you take it from here, and I'll click the slides so that you can share as you go along?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathy. So in speaking about SBP's vision, where do we want to go? At SBP, our vision is to be the most effective nonprofit at shrinking the time between disaster and recovery for clients across the United States. That's something that I think we all know is our vision. What's the plan to get there, or what is the strategy? We do this by offering disaster resilience and recovery services, advocacy, and rebuilding programs. What are the tactics, or what's expected of us? How do we get there? SBP, we talk about our 5 interventions. SBP seeks to achieve its mission via 5 interventions: rebuild, share, prepare, advise, and advocate. And one of the things that I just want to pause here for a moment is we, in doing the employee engagement survey and then hosting a couple small group sessions, learned that a lot of our team members are not as familiar with the 4 interventions outside of rebuilding. It's hard for folks to speak to those easily. So want to acknowledge that here. Number 4, how will we be supported, or what resources will we utilize? Our model is resourced through a strong leadership team, staff, volunteers, and greatly enhanced through a large number of AmeriCorps members across the U.S. and, sorry, not Puerto Rico, or not Bahamas, excuse me, no AmeriCorps members in Bahamas, but everywhere else. The vision of the founders, corporate partners such as farmers, of course, Toyota, UPS, and financial support from our donors. And then last, how will we be rewarded? What are the benefits? 1, personal and professional pride delivered by working in an organization who is changing the lives of our clients substantially. The more effective we are, the more funding we can secure, and the greater the number of families we can support, and providing ongoing growth and development opportunities for individuals and the organization.
So let me start. There's a couple of questions. One, I want to ask you what you guys think of the process itself. We're trying to talk through a step-by-step process to think about the translation from architect to achiever. But we're also here sharing an SBP example. So what questions do you guys have, either for me or for Kyle? Does this seem straightforward? And it's okay to say no, right?
I'll say no on number 3. If I'm the achiever, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. Those are all, they're all our interventions, but there's no task to be, there's no rose pinned on who has to do what, when, where, or why.
You're exactly right. So I think partly what happens in the translation down, I think you typically get it in this format from leadership. But what you're going to see as we translate back up is that achievers have some of those questions, and they have some needs. And so remember we talked about that's where we maybe modify the ask based on what we learned from achievers. So keep that thought, and we'll come back to that momentarily, okay? So keep this moving. So let's look at that process then. It's a 4-step process now, translating back up from the achiever to the architect. So a little bit simpler maybe. The initiative, so what is it we're trying to accomplish? What's the background? I do think some of the questions, Rand, that you just asked is, why are we doing this? Right? And I do think they're going to want to have some more information on that. Status, that section is where they're going to have some probably pretty considerable feedback that you as the translator are going to need to interpret for the architect. And then lastly, there's probably some recommendations. Now, I think part of this process you guys probably do naturally. It's pretty innate to who you are, especially if you've been managing people for some time. But I'm hopeful this process will break it down, because sometimes, remember we talked about you need to have real clarity in your communication. Sometimes when we get busy, or we're in a hurry, or we're in the middle of a crisis, which I know happens to you guys all the time, we kind of, jump to the end, and sometimes that's where the translation is lost. So let's come back to Kyle. Now, Kyle is going to share with us the translation from the achiever back up to the architect.
All right, so again, achiever to architect, this is how it could go. So they refer to the initial goal, or the initial strategy, which is the initiative. So our goal is to execute the vision and mission of SPP so that we are the most effective nonprofit at shrinking the time between disaster and recovery. Some background information is delivered through our 5 interventions: rebuild, share, prepare, advise, and advocate. That's the background information that we need to know. So that's our relevant detail. We're going to interpret the achiever feedback, or the status. So someone might say, we're deeply involved in one or more of our areas of focus, but having a better understanding of all 5 areas will allow us to be better advocates for the organization overall. And then some potential proposed actions or recommendations. Perhaps SPP could provide some training in all of our 5 key areas of service and help us understand what we can do to support those areas. Additionally, continue to report results of the organization against our stated vision and mission, so that we can continuously improve and celebrate success when we make considerable progress against these.
Okay, so let's talk about this. Does this seem like the typical feedback and conversation that you might get from one of your achievers if you were talking about the strategy and the mission of SPP? What do you think? Rand, did this kind of capture some of the questions that you had?
It did. It got to some of it. Look, I'm a detail guy. I'm a numbers, so I like extensive detail. But it does help. It gets to more of what's what are we doing here, and I think I can't remember if it was you or Kyle in the beginning said, it was Kyle. There are 5 interventions. Those that work in like the build, rebuild intervention, they might not know what's going on in the other 4. So a lot of times it's why is it relevant to me? And this does address it a little.
So the part of the reason for this example was, I think Kyle had mentioned that we had heard from the engagement survey, and we also did a couple of focus groups up front just before we got started on this leadership series, so I could hear a little bit more about what people were thinking and what they wanted in terms of leadership development. And I think what happens is a lot of times, senior leadership will pass stuff down, and they honestly, because you guys are the translators in the middle, they aren't naturally thinking about what achievers need to know, and so they give it to you at a very high level. And so you're probably already thinking, okay, I'm going to communicate this, but they're going to have a bunch of questions. So you can either translate that, you can either go back to the architect and say, could you give me a little bit more detail? I think it is totally okay if you get a message translated to you and you don't think it's enough, or you have more questions. Get those answered before you go to the achievers, but they will come back and say, this is what we need. So in this case, I really like this as an example. We've heard a lot of people say, we can't probably dive deep into the other 4 core areas, but are there any opportunities? Maybe there is something that we want to do. And that comes back to people's personal and professional objectives and why they're at SPP, maybe even especially the AmeriCorps members. I don't know whether there's anything outside. They already seem to have really challenging jobs, but the more people know about what's available, the more options they maybe have, and also maybe subsequent roles as people move through the organization. So what we'd like to do now is, this is an example, and I think it's still probably a little bit easier than just the process, but what we'd like to do now is to really bring this to life and let you guys do a little bit of practice. We did hear from some of the focus groups, like, don't just tell us how to do it, let us have an experience doing it. So I'd like to give you just a couple of minutes to read this. This is going to be our case study, and we're going to do a couple of breakouts following using this information. And what you're going to do is you're going to use the process to translate down. We'll come back and we'll let you share what you guys talked about in your breakout groups. Then we're going to also let you translate up, and we're going to come back and talk about what you had. And then as a part of that, Kyle also has he took a stab at his answers. We're going to compare what he came up with what you guys come up with. So take a minute and go ahead and read through this. I'll be quiet for a moment. And go ahead and look up when you've had a chance to get through this so that I know that looks like people are starting to do that. So that's excellent. Okay. Okay, so let me just be a little bit clearer on what we're going to do. As we move you into breakout rooms, we're going to do that very randomly, and you'll probably have 4 or 5 people in your group. If somebody is really very digitally astute, this slide with all the information and the next slide I'm going to show you are in your workbook. You may want to bring those up. You are able to share your screens in your breakout room. I am unable to do that for you. So you may want to take a picture of this slide if you need to, so that you have it as we move into the breakout rooms. And this is what we're going to ask you to do. Okay, we're going to use the example of translating SMART goals, which I know is something that you've recently done. So we're going to look at the 5-step communication framework, and you're going to use words and actions that your achievers will understand. So you want to try and speak their language and be as specific and actionable as possible. So I do think better translations are really more specific around what do you want them to do? What does success look like? So just as a refresher, the vision, where do we want to go? The strategy, what's our plan? What specifically do we need to do to get us there? Tactics, what tactics were shared with you about how we were going to translate and to implement the SMART goal process? Resources. So in that case study, were there any resources mentioned, things that are going to be made available to help you? And then, so what's in it for me, right? What are the benefits? So this is the slide that you're going to work on, and we're going to give you 10 minutes in your breakout group. So here's the challenge, right? You're not going to want to go really deep in any of these areas. I mean, you've got 5, so maybe you've got maximum 2 minutes each. Maybe someone could be a timekeeper, someone could share their screen, and someone could capture notes. When we come back, I am going to ask somebody from every breakout room to kind of share some of your thoughts, okay? So what questions do you have before I set up our breakouts and we head on out? Anybody have any questions? Have you guys done this before? Breakout rooms are great because it's just, you know, you'll have 4 or 5 people on video. It's a little easier to talk, and to have a good conversation. And I will be able to pop in. I won't get to all breakout rooms every time, but I'll try and pop in with all of you. But give me a moment. I am going to set up the breakout rooms. So there are 5 breakout rooms and we'll have 5 participants per room. And I need to make sure create the rooms, and then I just want to make sure I've got you set up for 10 minutes, and then you will have a timer. You'll have from the time you leave, you'll have 15 seconds, and you just hit a button and it will automatically bring you back into the main room. If you have any questions, I'll be popping in and you can let me know. Are we ready?